Well, thank you, Nancy, for that kind introduction. And actually, this presentation wouldn't be possible tonight without a tremendous amount of help from Nancy. She had to actually ask me 3 times over the course of the last year to do this presentation, and the 3rd time was at last month's meeting, or last March's meeting, when I finally agreed to do it. But I told her that I had done presentations many times with my friend and mentor, Wendell, on the M&H, but they were always slideshows. I had no experience with the PowerPoint presentation. So Nancy offered to put this PowerPoint presentation together for us tonight, so we're very grateful that she was able to do that. And the last time I spoke, one of the reasons I kept refusing to do another presentation was I thought, well, I just did one. But I lost track of time with the pandemic and everything, so the last time that I actually spoke here was in January of 2019. So time really flies. And at that time, we talked specifically about the role of the Middletown and Hummelstown Railroad, specifically in Lower Swatara Township, and also other forms of transportation that took place in the township, including the Conestoga wagons over the old road and the canal boats, of course the railroad, later the highway, the turnpike, and culminating with the Harrisburg International Airport to make an hour presentation. With the passing of my good friend Wendell Dillinger about 1.5 years ago, we were able to find a great deal of material that Wendell had put together from the time that he first became interested in acquiring and restoring the present-day M&H Railroad back in 1973, over the 50 years until his passing in 2023. So now we do have enough material to give you a presentation on the early days of the M&H and its influence on the surrounding area, including Middletown and Lower Swatara Township. So the sources of my information tonight on this presentation rely solely on the research of my friend Wendell Dillinger, who was the founder of the present-day Middletown and Hummelstown Railroad. And Wendell's sources of information included notes from Richard Hartwell, who is a noted local historian and artifact collector, the Hummelstown Sun, the Middletown Journal, the Press and Journal, the minutes of the original Middletown and Hummelstown Railroad Company, as well as the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad and Reading Company records, ephemera that Wendell had purchased at various sales and things that he attended, and interviews with citizens aware of the railroad operations, and of course the iconic book Early Industries of Middletown by Grace Dehart. Why is there a Middletown and Hummelstown Railroad? Well, the short answer and the main answer is to exploit the mineral resources of the Lower Swatara Creek Valley. This area of the Swatara Creek Valley, specifically in Lower Swatara Township and Derry Township, is very, very rich in deposits of limestone and brownstone. And secondarily, the railroad was created to provide freight competition to the Pennsylvania Railroad in Middletown. You have to remember, back in 1888, when the thought occurred to the folks to found the M&H Railroad, there weren't any cars and trucks. If you wanted to bring anything in and out of town in any quantity, you had to use the railroad. And Middletown was very heavily industrialized at that time. They had many large industries that cumulatively employed thousands of workers. The American Tube Company, which was basically run by James Young, who you're going to get a presentation on the next time, was a very large employer. They employed over 1,000 people. Raymond and Campbell Stove Works employed hundreds of people. The Middletown Car Company employed hundreds of people. There was, in addition to that, several iron foundries, a tannery, a cigar factory, a shoe factory. All of these folks had need for transportation in and out of Middletown. So if you needed to ship anything, once again, you had to rely on the Pennsylvania Railroad. So the Middletown and Hummelstown Railroad was envisioned by 18 visionaries, the founding fathers, as we would like to say. And they included John Rife, who was the co-owner of a tannery in Middletown, as well as a U.S. congressman at the time. H.B. Campbell, Joseph Campbell, C.W. Raymond, J.T. Raymond. They were all owners of the Raymond and Campbell Stove Works located at Brown and Union Streets in Middletown, where the present-day Carnes Market now stands. In fact, part of Carnes Market exists in one of the original buildings that's left of that stove works. George H. Grove of the Hummelstown Brownstone Quarry, E.M. Huffer, who was a wagon and farm implement dealer and owner of the National Hotel in Hummelstown, Joseph Strickler, a Hummelstown businessman, and he was the owner of a limestone quarry on the east side of Swatara Creek. And of course, we always have to have a lawyer involved, James J. Chamberlain, who was an attorney in Harrisburg. And finally, H.H. Bechtel, who was a contractor from Newport, Pennsylvania. And he is the gentleman who actually built the railroad. So the Middletown and Hummelstown Railroad was incorporated on July 1st, 1888, by the 18 stockholders, and the officers elected were John Rife as president, C.W. Raymond was the secretary, George Grove was the treasurer, and they actually hired Joseph Campbell to be the general manager to run the company operations day to day. There's a picture of John Rife. As I mentioned before, he was a United States congressman. He was born in Middletown. He served with honor as a private during the Civil War, and later he became a member of the Middletown Borough Council. He moved on to be elected to the state legislature, and then finally he was elected, I believe, to 2 terms as a United States congressman. So he was very well liked and very influential in Middletown and the surrounding area. All right, I believe everybody in this room probably recognizes this place on North Union Street in Middletown. It is Alfred's Victorian Restaurant. Well, it was originally built by C.W. Raymond as his mansion, and it was built after the M&H Railroad started up, and it was built with brownstone. It was actually mined in a quarry owned by the Middletown and Hummelstown Stone Company, which was a sister organization of the M&H Railroad. The same directors of the railroad also were directors of the Middletown and Hummelstown Stone Company. So that stone probably was shipped in over the M&H from the quarry out at Fry's Grove. And then, right across the street was another house you probably recognize. This was J.T. Raymond's house, located next to St. Peter's Lutheran Church. And you'll see this is built about half out of brick, but the other half is again built out of that brownstone that would have been mined in the quarry out at Fry's Grove. So after the railroad was incorporated, the next step was to select a route. So the Middletown Borough Council did pass an ordinance allowing track to be laid right down Brown Street. And as most of you know, that track still exists there today. J. Moorhead of Milton, Pennsylvania, was hired to survey different route options. And there were basically 2 options. The one was to use the Union Canal towpath along the old Middletown and Hummelstown Road. And the other one was to use the east side of the Swatara Creek. So they did select that first option, the Union Canal towpath, because it was a nice level right-of-way, until they got out around the end of Fry's Grove, and there were several farmers out there that objected to the railroad running on the towpath, and they refused to sign releases allowing it to be built on the towpath because they didn't want it to separate their grazing land and their cropland. So the railroad was built along the right-of-way of the old Middletown and Hummelstown Road, which was on the west side of Swatara Creek. Once they reached Stoverdale, there were three options north of Stoverdale. One was to just stay on the canal towpath and join the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad near Beaver Creek, west of Hummelstown. The other option was to go east to the Hummelstown Brownstone Quarry, and then north to the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad east of Hummelstown. So I'm sure some of the directors that were associated with the Hummelstown Quarry would have loved them to select that route. It would have connected with what later became the Brownstone and Middletown Railroad. And the third option was to cross the Swatara Creek just south of Indian Echo Caverns and go north into Hummelstown along Duke Street. And that third option was the one that was eventually selected. J.E. Richardson was hired to make detailed drawings of that selected route. So here we have a picture of the right-of-way. I believe this was taken around 1963, and this is on the right-of-way and along the right-of-way of the old Middletown and Hummelstown Road, which was on the west side of Swatara Creek. Today you might think of Swatara Creek Road, which runs along the creek on the east side, but back in the old days, if you went from Middletown to Hummelstown, you did travel along the west side of the creek. And now off to the left there is where FedEx is. But back then it was nice farmland, was last occupied by the Pickles. And we're township residents here, of course. And that is a partial view of their farmhouse there on the extreme left. And if you look between the fence line there and the farmhouse, you can get a glimpse of a ridge running across the pasture, and that ridge was the canal towpath, and the depression on the other side was the canal itself. So you can see why the farmers did not want the railroad to build on the towpath in that area. So next we have a picture of the railroad built right on the towpath of the old Union Canal. Now, to a novice, this picture might be rather deceiving because you think, looking off to the left, that that is the Union Canal. No, that water body there is the mill race that served Fry's Mill, which was built back in the 1700s in downtown Middletown. And you can tell it's not the Union Canal because of the size of the trees that are growing there. If it was the canal, having been abandoned in 1884, you wouldn't have large sycamore trees that size when the railroad was built. The canal is actually off on the right side of the train, and of course the water has been drained out of it. You may see what looks like some reeds growing up there in the canal bed between the railroad and the tree line. So this would be looking south toward Middletown. So once they had the right-of-way selected, the track laying began, and a contract was awarded March 12, 1889, to, lo and behold, one of the stockholders, H.H. Bechtel and Company of Newport, Pennsylvania, and H.P. Campbell was chosen to provide daily supervision. So again, they kept very tight reins within the stockholders on what was going on with the railroad. You'll remember Joseph Campbell was hired as the general manager, but H.P. Campbell was chosen to supervise the contractor. And construction began on March 14, 1889. And grading was completed to Stoverdale by May 1889, so it went very quickly. The reason for that was, of course, most of it was right on the canal towpath, which made a nice grade. And by grading, we merely mean you are leveling and preparing the roadbed before you lay the track on it. On July 5th, 1889, a track connection was actually made with the Pennsylvania Railroad west of Catherine Street in Middletown. And after that track connection was made, the M&H was able to acquire some equipment. They bought a used steam locomotive named Conewago from the Conewago Iron Works of Middletown. And the locomotive was actually prepared for service in the Susquehanna Iron Works. 2 gondola cars were purchased from Shaw and King Car Works of Middletown. Which later became the Middletown. Why does this keep turning off on me here? I think it's okay now. Which later have to hold it in?
Yeah, hold it in.
Which later became the Middletown Car Company.
Turn off again.
Which later. It just doesn't like it. For some reason. Okay, well, time out for a battery break.
Where was Fry's Grove at?
Fry's Grove was located at the end of Vine Street, just before you cross the Swatara Creek Bridge to go out of town. If you made a left there, some of you may remember the FARs did a presentation here, I believe it was last year or so, on Swatara Park. So the woodland that was out there on the other side of Swatara Park was Fry's Grove. Named after George Fry.
Sorry, I can't even get the battery thing off.
Early resident of Middletown. Some people do say I talk too loud, so I can maybe just continue this way if we can't get the microphone working. But as I mentioned, they did acquire the locomotive Conewago from the Conewago Iron Works of Middletown. And they purchased 2 gondola cars from the Shaw and King Car Works of Middletown, which eventually became the Middletown Car Company, which was located west of Wood Street in Middletown. And it would have been south of Main Street and slightly east of what was then Lawrence Street. And then they purchased a 65-pound rail from the Pennsylvania Steel Company of Steelton, which arrived in mid-June. Now, the Pennsylvania Steel Company eventually became what we know as Bethlehem Steel, and that went through several owners, and it is now Cleveland Cliffs, who, after 158 years of operation, now announced this past month that they're going to idle the plant. And that was the oldest continuously operating rail mill in the United States, dating back 158 years. So let's hope that they do either get some big orders in or find a buyer who's willing to continue operations there.
Can't get used to it, don't you get apart?
modern technology, and it just went off again. Hold it down. Okay, let's hope third time isn't a charm. I think I can talk loud enough. Can you hear me in the back?
Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll just continue without the microphone. So, when we talk about 65-pound rail, that doesn't mean that the railroad rail weighed 65 pounds. It means the way they classified railroad rail was how much it weighed per yard. So when they talk about 65-pound rail, it would have been 65 pounds to 3 feet or a yard. And out here on Amtrak today, that is very heavy rail. It's about 150-pound rail. But back in those days, the trains were not quite as heavy and they weren't quite as fast. So they started out with the 65-pound rail. Today on the M&H, our rail goes from 85-pound up to 100-pound. Except down Brown Street and on some of the main crossings, we have 132-pound rail. But once they acquired the rail and began to put track down, they could begin running trains. So rail was immediately located into the 2 gondola cars that they had purchased and carried to the end of the track for extending the line. Construction trains were running to East Middletown, or East Main Street, by June 6, 1889. So by East Middletown, that was one of the stations on the M&H. That is where Germac Electric is now, and where if you were going east toward Elizabethtown, it's where you went across the Swatara Creek there on the Route 230 bridge where you cross the railroad tracks. That would have been East Middletown. And Samuel Seltzer of Middletown, who was probably well up in years by then, because he rowed the first Union Canal boat into Middletown in 1828, became our very first honorary passenger over the M&H on July 12, 1889, to a point as far as the railroad was constructed. So since they had an engine, they needed an engine house. So the M&H built a siding east of present-day Clinton Avenue and west of Race Street along their main line. An engine house to shelter its locomotives was built right over that siding. By July 27, 1889, the track had reached Goose Island, which is just south of Fulling Mill Road in Lower Swatara Township. And by August 10th, it reached a point opposite of Stoverdale. So once it reached Stoverdale, the M&H could begin passenger service because the track arrived just in time for the big annual Stoverdale camp meeting. So on July 12, 1889, the M&H ran its very first passenger train from Middletown to Stoverdale for the opening day of the Stoverdale camp meeting using their 2 gondola cars. Now they had leased 5 passenger cars from the Pennsylvania Railroad in anticipation of having big crowds, but the Pennsylvania Railroad did not deliver those cars in time, so they had to improvise and use those 2 gondola cars on their first day of operations. Trains left from Union and Brown Streets. Jacob Core was the engineer and John Few was the conductor. And passengers could take a ferry operated by Charles Hauser from the train to the camp meeting on the opposite side of Swatara Creek in Stoverdale, or they could walk across a wire bridge which was located several hundred yards north of the station. The M&H leased those 5 coaches from the Pennsylvania Railroad, which finally arrived the next day on August 13th, and 7 trips carried 5,000 passengers. Fares were 25 cents from Middletown and East Middletown, and 15 cents from Clifton, which was their station at the end of Fulling Mill Road. Now, back then, Middletown only had a population of a little over 1,000 people. but yet they carried 5,000 passengers. So people came from all around. They probably arrived by train east from Lancaster County and west from Harrisburg and points north on the Pennsylvania Railroad, and then walked to the M&H station at Union and Brown Streets to board the train to get to Stoverdale. So after the camp meeting was over, the M&H did what most businessmen do. They did a little schmoozing. So on August 30th, 1889, the Middletown and Hummelstown Railroad originated a train at Stoverdale for over 200 invited guests from Middletown, Hummelstown, and the surrounding region, obviously hoping to impress several businesses and hoping that they would avail themselves of the railroad and give the railroad some business. The train left Stoverdale at 3:30 p.m. and proceeded to Middletown for a tour of the Raymond and Campbell Stove Works. And after spending some time in Middletown, the guests were returned to Stoverdale for a festive clam bake. And each guest was presented with a tin cup by the railroad as a souvenir. And I'm sure it was put to good use at that clam bake. And finally, after that trip and the camp meeting, construction resumed again. In October of 1889, a 700-foot cut was made through solid limestone parallel to Lock 33 on the Union Canal, beginning at Stoverdale. And stone from that cut was actually used to construct the bridge piers of the railroad's Swatara Creek Bridge. By November, the railroad had reached the Middletown side of the embankment to the bridge. Work also began in Hummelstown. Track construction began in September 1889, about 600 feet west of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad Station in Hummelstown. On October 11th, 1889, a gold spike, and that's in quotation marks because it wasn't solid gold, it would have been a gold painted or plated spike, was driven connecting the Middletown and Hummelstown Railroad on the Hummelstown end to the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad. So this allowed Philadelphia and Reading locomotives to transport ties, rails, spikes, ballast, and other supplies for construction over the M&H. The track was finally completed to the Swatara Creek by June 1890. Finally, the M&H was completed. Ties and rails were laid on the bridge on August 1st, 1890. And at 4 p.m., General Manager Joseph Campbell drove the gold spike, again in quotation marks, connecting the Middletown to Hummelstown. And E.M. Huffer, who you will remember was one of the founders and directors, took guests by train to the National Hotel in Hummelstown for a celebration. And here's a picture of the National Hotel. Some of you may remember it. They had excellent food right up until the time that it ended operations. This was owned by E.M. Huffer, and it was a wonderful place. I ate there myself as a boy with my parents, and after the modern M&H was completed, we ran special trains from Middletown to Hummelstown where you could get off the train, walk a half a block up Railroad Avenue, and have a wonderful dinner at the National Hotel. Unfortunately, the hotel was destroyed by an arsonist in 1992 and had to be torn down. So it was a great loss to Hummelstown and to the history of the area. And if you drive over there today, and you're familiar with that area at 2nd Street and Railroad Streets, you'll see that's where the Hummelstown Public Library is located.